Dear Morrie, I'm reading the next book on my journey, a book called Mortals by Menzies and Menzies. It helped in part to provide some amazing insights into the kind of people that would fall for the cult from the previous book. It shows people, when confronted with their own mortality, will cling tighter and tighter to their culture. They see culture as a sign of immortality and react to threats to that immortality with cruelty and anger. It also has some amazing insights I feel I can apply to my own profession. People who are confronted with death tend to cling to their relationships, even the bad ones. I wonder if that is why so many of my colleagues, and myself at a time, have clung to bad relationships. I also thought again about my colleagues when the book discussed protective factors against wanting to die, mainly finding meaning and purpose in life. I wonder if my colleagues found themselves, as I have, robbed of meaning when faced with the existential threat of a collapsing healthcare system. I found purpose from alleviating suffering, but with ever higher demands of resources, how much could my own actions ever really matter? I found myself less relieving suffering and more just trying to keep everyone alive. It brought back the crushing pang of despair I've felt over the last few years. It was in this despair that I read about and felt incredibly seen by Peter, a client of the Menzies. Peter had been feeling as if he no longer wanted to live, crushed with the existential idea that life may not be worth living. He was hospitalized with risk due to self-harm. The author tells his stories. He was taught to report his mood on a 10-point scale. He was told to give a 3 or under if he felt he was at risk. The scale confused Peter. He kept trying to explain he wasn't particularly sad, he just didn't want to live anymore. None of the work in the hospital particularly focused on his decision-making process, and so it had done little to change his outlook. His treatment was designed to show his family that the health system was serious about keeping him alive. That's all we ever do, really. Just keep people alive. I was especially struck by the acknowledgement that biases in the mental health system see sickness in anyone who declares that no longer existing is a viable option. I was reminded of a video by Philosophy Tube called The Cosmonaut, a piece that fundamentally changed how I viewed people that I came across who had similar conclusions to Peter. I reflected on my own, sometimes fleeting, sometimes persistent desires to set myself on fire outside the hospital I worked at, desperate for someone, anyone, please, for the love of God, hear us. Hear that we're drowning and hear that we're not okay. The book moves on from discussions about obsession and wishes for death to more healthy relationships with it. When it came to the 8 tenets of a good death, it eerily echoed advice that I had previously given people. Talk to your relatives. Find out what their wishes are. We won't be allowed to let people in and come and see you at certain times, and you might have to make a snap decision over the phone. It has always been a point of pride that my favourite human and my mother, the 2 people who would advocate for me in unfortunate situations, both know and can recite my wishes regarding life support. The book eventually lost me a little in its venture into stoicism and desire. It brought up a similarly problematic feeling I had to self-help advice and letters of comfort I have previously experienced, especially during the last few years. This feeling that this may not apply to me. It cannot account for differences between people in my line of work and quote-unquote normal lives. He discusses how the desire to sleep and eat cause us no anxiety because we have a choice about it, but I do not. My immediate thought was to that of me and my colleagues. We cannot choose when we eat sometimes, even if we desperately need to. Does this explain the distress that I sometimes feel at 2 p.m. when my relief is late and I haven't eaten since 6 a.m. and my brain goes to mush and there's no relief in sight and my stomach tells me that I've transcended hunger but my body has no fuel and there is just so much to do and there's so much noise and people need things from me? How do I account for my insomnia? Despite taking medications sometimes, just staring at the ceiling helplessly for hours if sleep is something I'm meant to control, is it part of the stress and burnout of having no control over such basic needs as when we have to relieve ourselves? Having to ignore key bodily cues in execution of our jobs. It poses that mental pain is the price we pay for any desire we cannot control, but when our bodies are no longer in our control, imagine the anguish that must cause. The author suggests the chief task in life is to simply identify and separate matters so that we can say clearly to ourselves which are the externals, not under my control, and which have to do with the things I can actually control. I worry that philosophies like this reinforce feelings of helplessness. How do I reconcile those with privilege and power and the privilege that power exerts? Do I just accept the fact that politicians have been eroding health systems, leaving people to die and erode large chunks of my meaning and purpose? How do I reconcile ethics with advocacy and stoicism? My favourite human's father is a stoic, and a frustration of mine is when I express witnessing injustice and his response is, but that's just how it is, it won't change. The book then brings up the real, potential stoic existential dread of climate change. They posit that individual people running companies are deluded into really believing that climate change does not exist. They don't account for lobby groups that trick people into believing that climate change doesn't exist by producing bad science. It suggests that they mustn't believe it is real because it's incongruous to believe that climate change could have catastrophic results and continue to promote business practices that destroy the climate. It concurrently pushes that one of the main drivers towards climate change is a population explosion. It posits the essential reason that people have children is to preserve their immortality. It spins a tale of selfish people trying to beat mortality by having excess amounts of children. While it never directly states it, the term I found coming to mind when reading it was the surplus population. I fundamentally disagree with the basic assumption this book makes about climate change. I believe it gives powerful individuals far too much moral benefit, to the point I felt myself getting annoyed with the authors. Is it not more believable that these powerful people absolutely believe in climate change, but the challenges to them are not insurmountable because they have amassed enough money and power to protect themselves and their future generations? They can preserve their legacy, hence preserving their immortality. I felt the demonization of people who have too many children in this book was particularly galling, not only due to the current American political climate, but because in our own country, the state that I share with these otherwise two brilliant authors, abortion was only made legal 2 years before this book was published in 2021. It's not even to mention access to birth control and education in the global south is limited. This book almost frames the fact that fetal death rates are down as a net negative for the human population. While I do not think they would ever explicitly say this, nor do I think they've fully thought through the implications of the rhetoric, I do wonder whether this would be an ideological point to argue that conditions for mothers in the global south, where 43% of newborn death occurs, should not improve. I wonder if there's an underlying racist idea that could be subtly intuited from these discussions. I feel like when I look at the two writers who hold high-paying jobs in Sydney, they may not have accounted for their privilege and ignorance when writing about particular parts of the book. They strike me as being infused with libertarian ideology. These concerns were not assuaged when, looking at their careers, I struggled to find any advocacy work or work in public health. I felt this book was useful in a number of ways. The conclusions right at the end left a sour taste in my mouth. It made me notice little things, like the subtle gender essentialism of women being more maternal and fulfilling more maternal roles, especially in nursing, which I may have otherwise just glossed over. Perhaps my lifetime of being a gifted and talented girl with undiagnosed ADHD, because that only occurs in boys, also makes me more sensitive to this kind of subtle gender bias in Australian psychology. Perhaps my male public health psychiatrist who examined an awkward teenage girl unable to make eye contact, who was so upset when she broke curfew because it made her mother worried that she threw up and grounded herself, who, when she told stories of self-harming, described it as her body behaving in a way where mentally she was trying to stop, but her body just wouldn't listen to her brain, whose parents described her as a daydreamer who would forget her head if it wasn't screwed on and would be so smart if she just applied herself. She had such an incredibly vivid imagination. When my psychiatrist took all of this information and decided to tell me his biggest concern was my lack of teenage rebellion, perhaps he biased me to the gendered assumptions that the psychiatric community can still fall into. I could not recommend this book in good conscience without first giving these warnings, though I do still think it's a book worth reading. Anyway, all of this to say, I miss you. I accept your absence as something I cannot control, but I embrace the wistfulness of missing you nonetheless. Without that, I would not also get the comfort from the warm memories we share together. So maybe I did benefit from this book a touch. Sending all of my love. Miss L.